Okay. How are you all doing today?
Just good.
Okay. Are you ready to get started? Okay. Well, welcome to the Westland Public Library. I'm your host, Sarah Chesney. Today we are here to talk about, well, with our local authors, character and environment in prose writing. See, I was totally taken off of your environmental aspects earlier. This program is scheduled to last for 1 hour. It is being live streamed. It is being recorded. You will be able to access the archives later. For those that might be trying to watch this live stream, mine was having a little bit of issues, but regardless, it will be live streamed. So, I want to welcome our guests today, Jeff Fearnside, Joe Wilkins, Margaret Malone. I want you to introduce yourself because the last time I read the introductions online, it sounded so terrible and so robotic that I'm like, I did not do the justice to the fabulous work you're all doing. So I want to start with you, Jeff. Welcome back. You did a panel with us not too long ago. So
Online, it went really well.
Yeah.
I'm Jeff Fearnside, and I have a couple of recent books out that I'll read two very, very brief excerpts from when we get to that portion. Both are set in Kazakhstan, so they really relate well to the concept of a place that we're going to be talking about today. And the Ships in the Desert is a collection of nonfiction essays, mainly environmental. I also talk about some cultural themes. And then this is a collection of short stories that won the Orison Chapbook Prize and recently won the Peace Corps Writers Short Story of the Year Award.
And show the audience. They're at the camera. Talk to the audience. Talk to the camera.
Okay. Yeah. So, Joe, great.
Yeah. I'm Joe Wilkins. I'm a poet and novelist. I brought this book to talk about, Fall Back Down When I Died. It's my novel that came out in 2019. And I'm at work on the next one, so that's what I'm also going to talk a little bit about is that process. I teach at Linfield University in McMinnville, Oregon. It's probably enough.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Margaret Malone. I write fiction and memoir, though mostly fiction these days. I have a story collection out. Let's see. This is my very well-traveled version. People like you. And I teach through literary arts and other places around town, and in Oregon Civic Center, places like that. And I'm really happy to be here with you guys.
Yay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming. So how the format is going to work is I'm going to ask a couple questions. If you have questions in the audience, please feel free to ask it. We'll take some time every kind of 10 or 15 minutes to allow the panelists to share some of their fabulous literature. I'm very excited about that. I loved hearing from your reading the last time you were here. A link to that panel will be included in the description. So,
I have it actually right here as well.
Yay! So take it with you, or take a picture. Okay, so the first question, and this kind of goes to everybody. We can start in any order, and it's up to you. I'm at your will here. How do you define place-based writing, especially in your literature that you're working with?
Well, I can jump in. To me, it's really simple. If you want to cut to the core, all writing has a setting, right? But place-based writing or nature writing, the place or the natural environment has to be essential to the story being told. It can't just be a backdrop. It can't just be background. It can't just be a place where things are happening. It has to be essential to the story. It has to move the narrative forward. I like to think of it as a place-based writing is the story could only happen in this place and in no other place. And if the answer is yes to that, then you know you have place-based writing.
The only thing I'd add, I think, Jeff, is that I always think of place-based writing as writing where a place is dynamic, where we see change across time, where we're aware of the history of a place, the possible futures, the ramifications of actions in the present, so that the place is a dynamic force inside the story.
Yeah, that's when I think about place, I link time. So it's interesting. The word dynamic is an excellent one because I feel like it's really easy to get distracted by place being landscape oriented, but I think place is absolutely related to time and what time is in the present, and also what you're saying about the future of a place, and especially as related to the natural world now. It's something I used to think place in relation to time was more like as culture is changing, or location is changing, or cities are changing, or the country is changing, but now the natural world is changing so quickly that time is now really interrelated to place in a way that I don't think I would have thought it related to the natural world if you would have asked me 20 years ago. I don't know that I would have linked it in the same way to the natural world, and now it seems so crucial to link time as well. So.
I think what you're both saying is the idea of place as character, especially what you're saying, Margaret, the idea that it's a character that has a lifespan. But yeah, if place is thought of as character, not just a pretty background, then yeah, obviously it's going to be critical to the story being told. So, yeah.
I like that. I'll turn. I love that. Back to you, Sarah. Our next question: how do place and character interact in your writing process? And you were kind of starting to touch on this, so I think this is a great segue. And how about we start? Yeah, if you wanted to.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say. So I started writing as a poet. I still write a lot of poems, and for me, often place is the root of most of the poems. I am somewhere. That poetic eye or poetic ear for the language is somewhere physically in the world, and that's what begins the poem. Is that particular place in the world. But fiction works a little different because. Suddenly characters become much more important. And it took me a long time to figure that out as I was trying and failing to write stories and novels. Place is still absolutely essential for me. It's really the first thing I'm thinking of when I'm writing fiction. But very close to that is who's here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just where are we, but who's here, and what's their relationship to this place, what's their relationship to one another. So for me, it's like just really quick from the one to the next when I'm writing fiction.
That's interesting, your hierarchy.
Yeah,
Usually
yeah.
people are switching in. They're like, what is the character doing and what leads them to this environment? Where you're like, what do I want to happen in this environment, it seems like.
I love that about poetry,
Yeah.
actually, and I'm much more like what Sarah's talking about is I almost always start with character and then ask myself, why is this person here now?
Yeah. That's probably the better way to do it, because like I said, I wrote a lot of short stories, novel drafts that failed because.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I don't think there's right. I think it's absolutely possible to start with place. I mean, I have a couple stories that have started with place, but I think it's for me, a more natural thing to start with character, and then for me to figure out, like, they are there for a reason in this moment in time. But it's often innate in a way I don't understand yet. And so it's only through the writing of it that I understand, like, place is important. Why is it important? Yeah. What about you, Jeff?
Joe's being very modest here. This novel is really great. And so, well, Joe, you mentioned relationship, the characters to place, and I think that's really important. But Sarah, the question I think you asked was, what's the connection, or how do you relate the two? And thinking in terms of relationships, I think is a good way to do it. To look at it, because of course then you have a story beginning to evolve out of that, right? And I'm like you, actually. My wife can attest to this. She's noticed that when I write poetry, I seem to be sparked by place more than anything else. It is different for fiction a little bit, although for me, because I did live in Kazakhstan, that's a place that when I write fiction, it immediately comes to my mind. Just as quickly as the characters do. In terms of the characters and the connection to Kazakhstan, because I lived there and knew people there, I'm often, even in my fiction, drawing on real life experiences, as we all do in our fiction. And the trick is to find something new and original to say out of that, and to find what the real story of it is, and not simply recount excerpts of snippets of things that I've heard on the street.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then you were discussing, I'm wondering how this really plays in, because we're talking, like, just as you were saying, time also plays a factor in time and place. And is there anything that you want to say on how time may change that interaction in your writing process? Like, has it really changed? Like, you may have swapped, like, it seems like you might have always been environmental and then kind of starting to incorporate characters later, and then vice versa, so.
So I can talk a little bit about the novel. I wrote a short story, and it was published in a magazine, and a friend read it and sent me a nice email, which was great. Send your friends nice emails, tell them nice things. But then at the end of the email, he said, so what happens next? And I was like, what are you talking about? That's the end of the story. He's like, oh no, it's not. And so that story was set in 1997 and involves a rancher illegally at that time killing a wolf in eastern Montana. And so then, of course, I started, the first thought was, oh, what is next? And I was thinking about what preceded this, what comes after this, what is this action that he's taken, how does it then sort of travel down through the years? And so this novel is mostly set in 2008, which is the year of the first fair legal wolf hunt in the state of Montana. And so it sort of moves back and forth between this action this one person took, and then how that affects both the place and so many other people of that place.
Well, Margaret, I'm glad you mentioned time, Margaret, because I think, especially with what's going on in the natural world right now, time is almost running ahead of us faster than we can keep up with it. You know, when I began the essays in this collection, climate change was pretty well known at that point. It was pretty well established. But water issues, not so much we were thinking about them. But as I kept writing the book, and as it was accepted for publication and went through the editing process, all of a sudden water issues began popping up everywhere. This book comes out this year, and suddenly this summer we saw Lake Mead fall to historic lows. We're seeing the Mississippi River, down to the mud. The Salt Lake, Great Salt Lake is drying up. And as I was editing this to get it ready for press, I could hardly keep up with the changes in the news, because I wanted to have the facts as up to date as it could be to the time of publication. So that's a challenge now. And if you're writing about environmental issues, is how do you keep up with the changes? And that's our job, of course, is to figure that out and to just do the best we can, of course. But,
And I think there's room too, as it relates to time. I mean, part of what I love about short fiction is it feels like it's like a photograph to me of a moment in time. And I feel like I hear what you're saying and totally agree with it. And I think it's also important to capture a minute of what it is, like what's happening right now before it goes away. And part of what's happening now is that like some things are holding steady and some things are not. And so I agree that part of our job is like, hey, pay attention to where things are headed. And I also think part of our job is to capture what is happening now, because it won't be like this for even separate from the natural world. We talk about the urban landscape, that shifts so quickly too. But I do feel like part of our job is also this like a memory photograph for people that either are here now and want to remember later, or who weren't here, who want to remember want to know what it was like to be here now, 20 years from now. So I feel like time relates in that way.
well, and I think that's the difference between journalism and literary writing.
Yeah.
Right, is what we're doing, it should have more of that lasting value. And journalism, I worked as a journalist for a few years, and so I really appreciate what journalists do, but it's a different thing. And their job is to stay more ahead of the curve as much as possible. But yeah, I like the idea that we're almost archivists in a way. Yeah, so that would be one way to look at the differences and how to approach it.
There's only so much photographs can capture, right? They can't capture the feelings that we're all going through during that time. So we're going to take a break from our questions in order to have a reading. Is there a preference on who would like to go through their first reading? Anybody who thinks that this would particularly match what we were just talking about, like character, place, and time? Okay, let's start with you, Jeff.
Yeah. Okay, so I have two very, very brief excerpts. Together, they're less than a page, so this won't take long. I wanted to give a concrete example of a scene, and then read a piece that talks more about the process of writing. Okay, so this is from the chapbook, and I'll just jump right in to it's the title. It's from the title story. Husband and wife are one Satan. For Raim and Railia, the cafe was their sole means of income, and one they managed themselves. They couldn't close it or take time off from work. So they moved into a netherworld ruled by neither matter nor spirit. They continued to come day after day, more like memories of themselves than anything else, going through the motions of opening the shop, preparing the food, and serving their dwindling number of customers. Autumn's fluid coolness gave way to winter's freezing snows, which blew down from the mountains and regularly, imperceptibly at first, added to what remained from before. In the same way, Raim bought bouquets of red roses whose petals over time withered and fell softly to the floor, gathering in drifts that neither Railia nor anyone else bothered to sweep up. After a while, the cafe was filled with the frail, crushed scent of roses underfoot. And so why I chose that is because I have several transitions like that in this particular story, where the transitions, of course, are meant to move things forward through time, but they also are meant to double the characters' feelings. And in this case, the movement from autumn to winter is mirroring the relationship of these two characters. And then it also allowed me to more directly link the transition to the roses, which then become something that is important later on towards the end of the story. So that's talking about connecting place or setting to character. And then this is from an essay called A Place as Self. Most of the essays in here are more memoir-like in tone. This more directly talks about the process of writing. And I'll just read a very brief excerpt here. Of writing scenes, a teacher of mine once said, "Remember to save a place at the table for one who is missing." In Kazakhstan, ghosts of its Soviet past lurk everywhere. When writing about that country, I often pull up a chair for the Soviet Union and watch how my characters, those people I knew and still know there, react to it. Some are drawn almost helplessly toward the empty space, longing for what once physically occupied it. Others act angry, and others still bored or disinterested. No one explicitly says a thing. All are aware of the spirit in their midst. So I talk about that a lot with my students when they're writing. If you can think of a scene as being a table, a dinner table, always remember to leave a seat for the ghosts. Because they may not be present, but we all have our ghosts in one sense or another that are influencing how we behave with the live people in the room. So.
Yeah, definitely. Anybody have any questions before I move on to the next one? Okay, no problem. Okay, moving on. How do you go beyond writing place as mere setting or backdrop to the drama of a story?
I talk with my students a lot about this often when they're writing essays and when they're writing short stories. Often is sort of the conflicts of the heart that are most they want to get to right away, and those are really good. That's often the reason we go to literature. But they tend to fall flat or feel forced or cliched if they're sort of just happening in this amorphous nether region. And so I often tell them that before you can do any of that good, important work, you have to make sure that there's some weather in the story, right? It needs to rain, or it needs to be way too hot, or like something like that needs to happen. And the character needs to go from somewhere to somewhere and not get there and be pissed off about that, or something like that. Like they have to encounter the place before we can get to that good, important, emotional work that we're excited about. And that forces them then to sort of pull to just not have a stage setting in the back and everything happening in front. It forces them to interact with that place.
Do you mind if I jump in? So that's a great example of just what I was talking about. The characters, their motivations and their feelings in the moment are going to affect what they see, right? So if you are thinking from the point of view of character, then you automatically are going to understand what it is they're seeing. So if you're writing from a particular point of view, even if it's third person, right? Third person omniscient can pop into other characters' minds quite easily. That's what makes it such a wonderful, squishy kind of point of view to use. And we're still always going to be seeing the scene from, in a way that's going to reflect the inner life of the characters. So yeah, that's a great place to start with that.
There's an essay by Dorothy Allison called Place that's in the anthology of Tin House Lectures. It's old now, but it's something I read again and again and again, and I have writers that I work with read again and again and again. And what she talks about that I love so dearly is she talks about the importance of talking about how a character feels about a place. So, which I feel like is like pinging a little bit with what you guys are saying, but there's a deeper thing she's talking about that is that I feel like works in any genre that you're working in, whether it's poetry or nonfiction or fiction. But the importance of understanding it's not just like here's the place and here's where we are and here's the now and here's how I feel about being here. I hate it here right now. Is really different than there's nowhere else in the world I would rather be than right here at this moment.
Yeah.
And those two things are really different, and they're also different than like, oh, it's okay, right? But they're all really important, and they're all three different people having three different experiences of the exact same place. And so for me, place is very, like, that's so, I've read her essay so many times, and it's become, I think was in my understanding in a way that I had not grabbed onto until I read her essay. And now I've like read it and taught it so many times. It's a huge part of me understanding place. And to the point now, if I read something that doesn't have the feeling of the place in it, I get itchy, right? Or I'm like, yeah, but like, what's it about? What did she want to be there? Yeah. So those are linked.
Margaret, for me and for everyone else, can you repeat the name of that essay?
Yeah, so Dorothy Allison, it's just called Place.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's, I don't know, it might be online at tinhouse.com, or you can just buy, there's like an anthology of Tin House Lectures, and all that, so they're great. But that's one it's a really accessible read in the way she talks about, because it's Dorothy Allison, so it's really, really easy to just like fall right in step with her. So yeah, I recommend it. It's awesome.
Yeah, you don't want something amorphous going on in the background. It's
No,
just like,
unless you do,
right,
for a very intentional reason. Yes.
But this is what makes you an author,
Right. Yeah, totally.
Excellent. Anything else anybody wants to add? Okay, perfect. Moving on. How does place affect a character's internal landscape? Which is a big one. And Morgan, we haven't started with you yet, so hate to put you on the spot.
No,
Please
it's
feel free.
okay. I mean, I feel like place, I can make an argument, and I don't mean this in just a subtextual way, but I mean, I think place is, like there is internal landscape, and I feel like there's a way that there's a reciprocity happening there between those two things. You know, just thinking about even Russia right now, like Russia and Ukraine, like you can't separate what's going on with someone who's in either of those locations, no matter what side that they are on. The beingness of being there is part of who they are, and they are who they are because of being there in that moment. And so that's sort of an extreme example, but I use it only because it's an easier way to understand what I think is true no matter where the place is. And so for me, place, whether it's the natural world or an urban landscape or a room or a backyard, is, you know, there's an expression of the person we're taking the time to write about happening internally. And I feel like, Jeff, you were hitting on this a few minutes ago anyway, that's being expressed the internal landscape is expressed in the place. If I'm choosing to write about someone sitting in a backyard, that's really different than me, taking the time to write about someone sitting in a stadium at a soccer match or a whatever in the middle of a fight. So for me, they're absolutely intrinsically linked. But it is still, there is a way that I find it really difficult to talk about because place feels like character and character feels like place. And there is a quality to it that has a little bit of like, I don't know it if I see it, but but I know it when I'm in it.
I was thinking, I mentioned this class I teach where we do these field excursions, teaching within the colleges. And one of the reasons, it's a lot of work. I mean, you're taking a dozen or a dozen and a half 19-year-olds out into the woods for 48 hours, and you get home and you're like, woof. But it's wonderful because suddenly in this new space, they're both themselves, but suddenly their internal landscape shifts as well because we're out in the Kalmiopsis wilderness, right? And so suddenly they become these new selves, even as they're saying themselves. And I think that's, as you were talking, I was like, oh yeah, that's what's going on there. Is their internal landscape has shifted because of the external landscape, right? They're allowed to be someone different, maybe a little braver or a little more thoughtful or something in this new place. So.
Yeah, and so you're talking about how place can change how we feel over time, and of course we're born in certain places. And if you're born, I was born in Midwestern Ohio, and so that's very different from growing up in New York City, right? And then the imprint on me is going to be very different. So in terms of characters, it's just a matter of understanding characters. I'm one of those people who actually writes character bios. I don't know if you do this. I write bios for all of my characters. The information I might not ever use 90% of it, but I really want to understand where are they coming from and what are their motivations so that when I put them in a story, I understand they would do this and not this. And place would be one of those things. Where are they born? Where do they live? Some of the questions Margaret was asking, what do they like? What do they like?
Yeah.
Right? And that would include what kinds of places do they like to go to, what things they like to do. So yeah, all of that is going to contribute.
Can I just add, I just want to jump on because what you guys were saying is so interesting. And Joe, I was thinking about the idea of taking students out into the woods or outside of their normal experience and just realizing that I think also what's happening with the idea of the interconnection between place and internal landscape is this idea that I think is also important and I think is also related to this idea of the feeling of place is knowing if a person is in a landscape that is familiar to them or unfamiliar to them is also really important in writing because it means we are getting access to a version of them that they're familiar with or not familiar with. And that information is also incredibly useful and fascinating. And when I write and when I read, I love to know, are you showing me a you you're familiar with? Like, is this who you are all the time? Or are you showing me a you don't know who they are yet because of it's revealing itself in the moment together here on the page. And that all seems sort of interconnected with this idea too.
That was going to be my follow-up comment. I
Oh,
think that's really the difference of perception when you're actually in the place, like you write about Kazakhstan, and how does it change? Even in different stages, like these kids or you are writing it in one place, and then you literally go to another place, yet your internal landscape is still in this other place, and how does that affect your writing process and stuff like that? So, all very fascinating.
Yeah, I tell my students sometimes, if you want to test your characters, you drop them into a new situation. I hadn't thought it makes sense. Just drop them into a new place is another way to do that.
Yeah, go right ahead.
What about when you're writing? Do you ever change where you're actually physically writing your own setting while you're creating?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's cheating.
How does it affect the work, your perception, your internal process?
I used to, when my children were small, I used to go to my campus office to write because it was quiet. And then the pandemic hit and we weren't going to campus, so I was writing from home and figured out how to do that. And now I kind of do both a little bit. But then, a number of years ago, I was down on a wilderness residency on the Rogue River. And it took a while to and if you've done writer's residencies, you're in this new space, you're in this new little area, and it sometimes takes a little bit, there's a little turbulence as you're kind of getting yourself going, but once I got going, it was so productive. I felt like I was, I could spend twice the amount of time I usually do at the writing desk in this new place. I think it was kind of the excitement of it and just the new place. That's what it was for. This was for writing, and so I was going to do a lot of writing in there.
So I must have misheard your question. I thought you were asking if we changed the places that we were writing about.
No, where you are when you're doing the writing.
Oh,
In the same way that like the students would go to a different setting.
Yeah, what made me think of it is
Yeah.
they were influenced by where you placed them. So if you're sitting there and creating, and you're always in the same easy chair or the same desk, would you have a different experience? Would you create something different if you were in your car, if you were at the library?
yeah. I need to shake myself up sometimes.
Yeah.
So if I'm in the doldrums, I actually like white noise around me. I don't know why, I find it very comforting. So going to a really busy place where I don't know people, and that's the key. If you know people, they will interrupt you, and that's a totally different thing. But if you're in a busy place where you just have that white noise around you, I find that very centric. And so I like to go to a coffee shop or a restaurant or something and write there. It kind of shake me out of sitting in the same chair all the time. And I've had the experience too, writing residencies are great. A great way to kind of kickstart a whole new line of thinking, a line of writing, for sure.
And did you want to add to that?
You know, I mean, I feel, yeah, I think changing location is critical because it puts you back in that mindset of exploration instead of expectation, which is a very dangerous place for a writer to be. So yeah, like yes, move around. See, I'm such a like, and also have rituals that you keep the same every time. So I think both are important for me and having a successful practice.
Kind of in the same vein, when I would often sit to write myself, I would often find that if I'm just doing like exploratory writing, where it's just kind of like free form, where I don't really care what I'm writing at the time. When I'm in that situation where I'm in a place with a lot of white noise, I often find that my writing tends to veer more towards like one-on-one or like, not to use colloquial too much on like intimate scenes or just more quiet sort of things. But when I'm in places of like absolute silence, like in the middle of the woods or like in a room by myself, I'm often writing about like large crowds or big events happening or loud things going on. So I often find that's a weird like dichotomy. Do you often find something like that going on with yours, or do you feel like your environment, like your own environment you're in, like in the same vein, shapes what you're writing about if it's just open form writing, or do you feel like it helps enhance your writing in any way, depending on what you're trying to do as a subject matter?
I don't know how to quite answer that. But I'm going to grope my way towards it. My wife has noticed something about me. She can tell when I'm in a good mood when I put on the freakiest, strangest, most cacophonous free jazz. Then she knows that I'm in a really good mood, and she knows that I'm feeling calm and mellow. I don't know what it is about the free, this really crazy free jazz that just helps me center. I have a feeling it has something to do with what Natalie Goldberg called calming the monkey mind in her very famous book on writing called Writing Down the Bones. It's a way, I think of it as a way of throwing our monkey mind a banana and giving it something to do. That free jazz takes my busy brain and sets it off over here so that now the better part of me is open to be able to write and do the kinds of things I want to do. If it's too calm, I can see why things would fill in because nature abhors the vacuum, right? Yeah. That's when suddenly you've got every possibility in front of you.
Jeff, I'm also thinking about chapbooks, and that's a completely different experience of being in the woods with no music, no TV, and completely quiet, where you write more nature. Poetry.
She's talking about this residency that I'm very lucky to get to take pretty much every spring at Chapbooks Cabin. It's administered by the Spring Creek Project. And I do, it's we never bring music with us. We're out in the middle of nowhere in the woods, and that's an example of when I have all the space in the world, and yet I'm laser focused. I always I'm very productive out there. So I guess the answer is one size doesn't fit all, and anything can happen in any circumstance.
And I was just thinking, like, what you were saying, you're in a grocery store and you're just thinking about these characters and you're like, what would they do in this circumstance? And all of a sudden you're off and your brain is going. And it's not even the same world, even the same environment, but it's just off. So I did want to take a time out so we can do another author reading. Are we making our way down here, or who would like to go next? Okay, well, we talked a lot about yours very recently, so let's go with Joe. We keep referencing you a lot right now.
Okay. I'm gonna, before I read, I realized I'm gonna ask about the policy on swear words.
Yeah, that's actually good to know.
Is he okay with it?
He's good.
Okay.
He's got me.
2 seconds. Video audience, there will be swearing at this point. If you're a child, please turn away. Okay. We do not restrict creative writing, so.
When the book came out, we had a book release at the brewery in town, and it was really fun, but everyone brought their kids because it's this great place for kids to run around. But then, and I thought they'd just keep running around up there, but then when the reading happened, they all filed in and said, and I was like, oh. And later, one little boy came up and said, you're sitting that word.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just a little, maybe the first 2 pages of the novel I'm at work on now, titled All Apologies, and this is in 1994, April of 1994, and this is the first section here is called Into the Noise.
Do you mind if I stop you for 2 seconds?
They're going to hit you.
They heard you in swear.
They heard you were doing a swear word. Okay, now that this is pretty good, but I didn't want everybody to be distracted while the siren's going in the background. So.
Right. Into the Noise. After the pickup sped past, he crawled up out of the weeds and started again down the slope of the mountain road, paperboard guitar case in hand, green canvas backpack jouncing about his ears and shoulders. The cold afternoon light hazed with road dust. He was moving fast, breathing hard. He could taste it, the dust. At the one-lane river bridge, he looked both ways up and down the road, no one coming, not as far as he could see. He hugged the battered guitar case to his chest and took off at a near run, the knock of the instrument inside making a kind of music. The rusted struts of the old bridge rose above him and slid over him, and the thick cross-hatching shadows darkened his vision in time as he breathed, as he ran. Halfway across, a fishing boat bobbed around the upriver bend, flylines curling through the air and lighting on the deep green water. The man at the oars spotted the boy, lifted his chin. Fuck, here he was, a kid, 16, but so skinny and small, people often mistook him for younger, with an army surplus backpack and a guitar running across a nowhere bridge and a nowhere road on a Sunday afternoon. Fuck, fuck, fuck. He slowed, waved back, tried to pretend everything was okay, it was as it should be. He got good at pretending. Across the bridge and out of sight, he ran once more until his heart sounded hard in his ears. A little less than a mile on, the gravel road opened onto a blacktop highway, the tight green dark corridor of forest opening as well, and he held up. It was a few miles east of Nye. He couldn't catch a ride here, not yet. Someone from town might recognize him. He'd ridden a school bus with his little cousins and a few other Nye kids all the way to Ozorki. Had picked up the mail at the post office any number of times for his aunt, his uncle hauling him to Trading Post beer runs. That was before Uncle Heck stopped letting him go to school, go anywhere, before it got bad. Crouched in the yellow grass and pine saplings at the edge of the road, the boy dug his hands into dead needles, into gritty, fungal-smelling soil. Don't think about Heck's astonished face, the swollen weight of the splitting wall, his heart, a hot, mad animal in him. He rocked and leaped up and ran along the gravel and weeds and stopped. Breath hard in his ears and slid back into the woods. He had to be smart about this. These were the hours that mattered most. The road would be faster, but he didn't want to risk being spotted. If he tried to run in the woods, he'd trip over a rock or root and break his ankle. He split the difference and paralleled the road just inside the forest, moved slowly, carefully, watching his every step.
You can kind of hear your background in that as he's digging through the ground. I'm like, knowing you now, I see all of that. I don't know if that has an influence. That would be another question, is knowing the author and how that changes your landscape in the reader's mind. But that's its own other panel. So moving on. Can a character's internal feelings create a sense of place beyond the where of the setting?
Yes.
Moving on.
Well, I was going to say, I think it goes back to some things you were saying earlier, Margaret, about how people are feeling about a place. It can also be something you were saying earlier, Jeff, that sense of we're carrying other places with us, even as we're in this place, right? And how those two things are interacting.
Yeah, it ties back, I think, to what we talked about earlier. What the character is feeling about a place is telling you a lot about that character. So yeah, for sure. What they're feeling and what they're seeing is going to reveal a lot about the character and also about the place. Specifically the relationship of the character to that place. That's what is going to reveal more than anything else. And that's really important. It's something that good writing should do.
It's reminding me of, I just recently read a book called Lanny by Max Porter. Do you guys know Max Porter? His first book was called Grief is a Thing with Feathers, that was people read. So Lanny's his second book, and it's a little more experimental, and it does all kinds of cool stuff with like text all over the page. But in addition to that, place is such a big part in a way that is the way place can become a character sometimes. And so I feel like that's another element too of this idea of the internal landscape, that there are times when, in a very direct way, the place itself has internal feelings that can talk and become a character and bring that alive in the story as well. And I love that idea and playing with that, and I think that is, and Lanny does that arguably in some ways, but I like that idea too of remembering that place, giving place a chance to talk. I think is really, really important.
Yeah. Joe mentioned that earlier, that a place has a history, right? And that's where it talks, and it has a geology, and it has a geomorphology, right? It changes over time, and so many stories, literally in the strata of rocks and soil, and human debris that have been buried and sifted down through it. So many stories in there that the place can tell without having even a character around to speak for the place.
Excellent. How important is place in a piece of writing? Does that change, grow, diminish depending on the genre being written? Poetry versus creative nonfiction, or creative nonfiction versus fiction? Sorry, throwing big questions at you. Take your time.
I was just going to say, for me, it's like I said, in poems, one of my first thoughts is, where am I? You know, where in the world are we? And I think that's pretty, maybe not always. It depends again on the piece, but often that's the very first question I'm engaged with in prose as well, but not all the time.
Well, and I have to imagine for like poetry, you kind of got to get to the point a lot quicker since, I mean, not that poetry can't be long, but that's the general expectation is you're getting to a point, or short story, or
Can I ask you a question as a poet, which is just how often do you name place in your poetry? And name, you can expand that definition however you want, but.
Quite a bit. When I first started reading contemporary poetry, so I grew up on a farm in eastern Montana, and I didn't know people wrote poetry. I thought that we'd written all the poetry and now we just read it. I didn't know something that still happened, right? And so when I was in a writing class in college and started reading poems from Richard Hugo and James Wright, and these people who were deeply enmeshed in the places they were writing from, I was just thrilled that you could say a specific place in a poem. It seemed like sort of like, I don't know, it felt sort of illicit somehow, and so I was doing it all the time. So I do it quite a bit. But it doesn't always stay. Sometimes it's in early drafts and then it leaves. And sometimes there's multiple places in a single poem, so we get some of that. But very often I am, and I'm always looking for interesting names of creeks or roads or whatever, that kind of stuff.
well, and I wonder if there's a danger to that, like people, you create a place and somebody has a different affiliation or mental image of that, as you're talking about, internal landscape of that.
Well, there is, but I would argue that if you want to make something universal, it needs to be more specific. The misconception, especially among student writers, is if you want something to be universal, you have to be almost intentionally vague about it, right? Because then the idea is you can read anything into it. But I found that if you describe something specific, everyone's going to bring their own version of what that is to the reading anyway. So the more you can bring them to their own understanding of something is actually going to help open that up to them. So I think specificity is really important. And I would go to the naming of places. I know there's a school of thinking in poetry that you shouldn't name places and be too specific, but I disagree with that. I'm like you, I tend to write very specifically about very specific places.
Excellent. Well, you're writing about like places that actually exist, and both of you, but do you ever take like setting up that place in a fictional landscape, because we didn't really touch on that. I mean, in a fictional landscape, you set this place and then you can reference it later. I can also imagine that having value in your writing as well. Okay, so I want to give you the opportunity to read. Yeah, because I'm like, oh my gosh, how are we already almost 10 till?
Sure, we're good.
Or 15 till, because that's a little fast. But I still wanted to give you the opportunity
Thanks.
to read.
Yeah, I brought, when I was thinking about what to read, for some reason the thing that stuck out the most to me was, it's like the very first thing I got published years and years and years and years ago, and so I brought like the journal from all that time ago. And it's funny, I was trying not to think too hard about why it was occurring to me, but I think part of it has to do with this idea of, you know, like place and feeling and time. And I think my brain telling me this might be interesting to read helped me understand what I do think about the relationship between place and character and time. So anyway, I'll just read a short, whatever, couple minutes. Okay. So it's from a short story, and this is not in my collection, but it's called Sailing Alone Around the World. I meet him at night in Greenwich Village during the NBA Eastern Conference Finals, Knicks versus Bulls, Game 4. There are groups of people crowding the streets, peeking from sidewalks into bars and restaurants. Everyone's watching the game, their cheers and sighs, keeping score. In my backpack are jeans, a toothbrush, socks, and a steak knife I stole from a restaurant. I'm trying to look like I know where I'm going. He is sitting on top of a yellow newspaper dispenser, the Daily News maybe. He straddles it like it's his spot. It is. He knows everything about this corner, where 3 small streets converge. He knows everyone who walks by, their schedules, their habits, what drugs they use, who's gay or pre-op. He doesn't know me. Girl, he says. I don't respond. Hey, your name. It's not a question. I am past him now. I could keep walking. But this is why I am alone in New York. 18 and nothing to do for a day and a night. I am looking for adventure. I turn around. I say, what's yours?
That was an excellent illustration of what we were just talking about, because I could see the street scene. I knew that street in New York. It's just like, yep, we're all there all of a sudden. So,
Yeah.
Any questions before we move on? Okay. You've been doing great asking questions as you get them, so thank you. Genre fiction is often defined as plot-driven, while literary fiction is often defined as character-driven. Where does this leave plotting in literary fiction?
Well, I mean, whether it's genre fiction or whether it's literary fiction, it all had, or even nonfiction, or even poetry. This will take much longer than we have here. I have the argument that even poetry, even lyric poetry or imagistic poetry, has narrative to it. And the narrative may not be expressed, but anyway, it all has story to it, right? So the question isn't whether one has story or one doesn't have story. The question is, how do you approach the story? And I think in literary fiction, you do want to try as much as possible to not follow some preordained idea in mind of what it is you want to write, but allow the characters on the page to lead you. And when I talk about this, I always feel a little hesitant because it almost sounds mystical, and I don't think it's a mystical process. I think I don't think the characters literally come to life and begin, speaking in your ear or anything like that. But it's about, I think, what maybe I would term deep imagining. And the more you can imagine another life that maybe was sparked by somebody you knew, but is now beginning to take on own personal characteristics. That's where you're going to find your plot, your story in literary fiction, as opposed to genre fiction where plot points are expected to be hit at predictable beats. So yeah, deep imagining. That's what you're looking for in literary fiction or any kind of literary writing.
When I think about that question, I think about two writers in particular, and I can't even begin to pretend that I'm a facile genre reader. Like there's worlds of science fiction and fantasy that are rich and I know nothing about, and so I'm just gonna lay that out here and not pretend that I know.
It's a safe place.
Yeah, please
read what you want to read.
Love me anyway, and my son who loves fantasy, so just love me anyway. But I think I can't think about this idea of place and internal landscape and how it directs plot without thinking of Octavia Butler and Ted Chiang, who's I know their short work. Well, Ted Chiang obviously, but and because I feel like they're considered genre writers, but the way that they access and drive plot to me is very much steeped in the it's driven by an internal engine, especially. I'm thinking of this short story by Octavia Butler called Speech Sounds. You guys ever read this? About being on the bus, kind of in the middle of the collapse of the end of the world. Anyway.
Sounds delightful.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is. She makes it, catastrophic and delightful at the same time. Delightful is not the right word, but
Enjoyable?
yes, enjoyable. Yeah, and enjoyable to be with her at the end of the world. Yeah. Yeah. But both of those writers write, there's big plot happening when they write, but the plot happens because of something that we originate that's happening inside. We are introduced as happening inside the narrator, or more than one of the narrators, and for me, I feel like that's just like full admission how I understand the world anyway, and how I understand literary fiction. And it's obviously not the only way to think about writing or fiction at all. But I feel like there's also, it's good to remember that because I have a harder time accessing plot as being a starting point when I write, it's really good for me to remember, it's just a different way. Like the people that are starting with plot, like that's just the driver that leads them to the internal world of the narrator. And the same way that I understand, like, I can access the plot and the external world happening through the internal, what's happening, the internal landscape of my characters. And so I always think of Octavia Butler and Ted Chiang just like having this deep ability to convey what's going on internally with their characters in the midst of chaos, but it's like that is what provides the action. So,
yeah, I agree with all that, and I don't do any kind of mapping. I probably should do more as I'm writing novels. And sometimes, I don't think of it as plot, but like something's happened. Often when I'm starting a short story or working on a longer piece, and it's either it just happened or it's happened in the past, and it's bringing this force to bear on where the character or who the character is and why they're where they are, and then that just feels like it sort of pushes you toward other things happening. That's how I feel like plot naturally arises for me. Is whatever it is that's back there is pushing on them, and you just can't help but things start to happen. That deep imagining. That internal landscape pulling them forward, right?
Yeah, I'm not big on plotting either, but as I said, I read character bios, which is in a weird way a form of plotting, I suppose. If you think of getting into the character's head in order to understand what's going to happen to them as plotting, then I'm plotting in that sense. But it's really trying to come at it from the point of view of the characters. Certainly I think it's okay to write about stories. Sometimes the impetus to write something is an event that we read about, and that's what causes you to want to write about this thing, not the characters so much. But I found, and you probably have found this too, if you focus too much on trying to force a plot, it just doesn't, it doesn't go anywhere. And then you really have to understand characters.
Exactly. Well, we have 5 more minutes left, actually, less than that. Anybody want to ask any Dying personal questions?
Rewind.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So just kind of a question that's kind of been forming in my head throughout. So bear with me as I'm trying to articulate it properly. I've often found while reading authors and different stories throughout history, a lot of authors are trying to answer a very similar question when it comes to environment, where, and I suppose it's kind of a two-parter and a bit on a sliding scale. Do you see environments as this like dead thing that we are just kind of experiencing, or do you see it kind of like almost the exact opposite? It's like this almost divine being that's like beyond our comprehension. And then on the other side of that, do you believe that environment is something that's like thinking, feeling, or do you feel like it's something that is beyond any sort of like decision making on its own sort of thing? It's just something that's more our own hubris, like seeing our own choices reflected on some like uncaring environment.
I can give my quick answer to that.
Yeah.
I personally feel like you can't go into nature and not sense some kind of great intelligence. That's just my own personal feeling. However, what that intelligence is and where it comes from, I have no idea. I just accept the mystery.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely place and the environment is dynamic and changing and interconnected and subtle and nuanced and all kinds of, I mean, just so many cool things are happening all the time. I try to spend a lot of time out on rivers, and I can't think of a better way to spend an afternoon than sitting and watching things happen along the river, because so much is going on.
It's always changing and always flowing as the sun goes.
Yeah. And I do think places begin to, in the human mind and the human heart, begin to suggest things. And so again, that gets back to kind of the beginning of our conversation, that places start to suggest certain stories or certain ways of being. And so they are absolutely, we are also a part of that manifold web of stuff.
Yeah. Thinking, feeling alive, an animal, like every single place is like being inside the belly of a different animal.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's inside or outside, present or past, natural world or office building.
Yeah.
Like that's why the description of it is so important, and that's why it feels different to every character depending on like what stress is it putting on them, what stress is it alleviating. Like it's alive for me. It is so alive. And that is separate from naming the place. Like I think that's why sometimes I actually I don't name place very often unless it's absolutely critical. But I hope, I hope that the feelingness of being inside this particular space, whatever it is, comes across, because I do feel like it's so alive.
Yeah, because there's some things that transcend different cultures or different cities or different places. So being able to harness a place versus a specific place based off of the title is really important.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's true, because I mean what you're saying is exactly right, because I'm thinking like no matter what your culture is, what time you've lived in, your socioeconomic situation, your race, your gender. If I said to you to conjure up an idea of home, you would have a known or ideal feelingness that came across that, whether you actually ever had an experience of it or not. And so that's a really great example of like place isn't always like my address, right? There is a part of place that isn't just like me telling you my address isn't the same as what it feels like, this idea of home. So yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I just, like Joe, I have a class that I just took out into the woods, and we were writing about what we saw. But it was interesting, so many of the students kept writing about home. And the place in front of them kept sparking associations of other places that they felt a connection to. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be specific.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to expand this so I can get myself, it's been focused on you the whole time, the most important part. That's the end of the hour. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. That was very enlightening. I did want to mention that apparently the live stream did not go out, and I apologize greatly. It's connected. I see it on my YouTube end. It did not go to my phone. So I apologize. This will be available later as a recorded video. It will be promoted. Everybody should hear this. I always think it's wonderful, the presenters that we bring in. It was so enlightening, so stimulating. I want to thank you two for the questions that you're asking, for your helpful word as well. Any last shout outs that you would like to do before we close out the hour?
Well, thank you for one, Sarah.
Thank you so
for
much,
hosting
Sarah.
us and giving us in this great space,
Yeah.
asking all these great questions, and being so attentive.
Yeah.
Trying to be,
Yeah.
or at least while that was all going on. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed this lovely kind of rainy afternoon. Go enjoy a book about landscape,
Yeah.
internal and external. Have a great day. Yay, thank you.
It's we're all used to it.